last session today. And we have Dr. Richa Kumar with us. She is an associate professor of sociology and policy studies at IIT Delhi and holds a position as associate faculty, School of Public Policy, IIT Delhi. Her research and teaching interests are in the sociology of agriculture, food and nutrition, science and technology studies, and rural and agrarian policy. She is a co-author of the State of Rural and Agrarian India Report 2020, and her current research is on the impact of monoculture farming on farm systems, environment, and human health. Her book, Rethinking Revolution, Soybean Choppals and the Changing Countryside in Central India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. She is a recipient of the inaugural Elizabeth Edisacia Memorial Award. I hope I pronounced it correctly, the New India Fellowship 2010, and is a member of the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies. Today, she'll be speaking on Green Revolution and beyond. The widely accepted success of India's Green Revolution in making the country self-sufficient in food grains has made it the model for all agrarian futures envisioned in the country. Through a talk, she will argue that this vision is based on a selective understanding of India's agrarian past as backward and something which needed some sort of redemption. By revisiting India's agrarian history and outlining the circumstances under which the Green Revolution model was adopted, her talk will challenge this blind adherence and hopefully open up ways to envision futures that can begin to address the needs of the country and countryside. So I now invite Dr. Kumar to deliver her lecture. Please, and yes, as she also requests now, please switch on your video and ask questions. You can type your questions in the chat box, and you can raise your hands. I will be, she might not be able to see it because will be sharing her PPT. I will be coordinating and letting her know if there are questions. So please make it as engaging. And this is the last session, so we should all be very energetic today. Yeah, so Richa, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Tirtha. I actually don't have a PPT. I just thought, I have one picture I want to show at one point of time. But I thought, we'll probably have more of a conversation. So, and I'll really request everybody, if you guys don't mind, I know it's late in the evening, but if I could see a few more faces, thank you, Gayatri, for turning on your video. It's okay. Dr. Tyagu, thank you. Good to see you. So let me actually begin by, talking, and I guess as Dr. Tirtha said, I won't assume that many of you have had a chance to look at the three different pieces I mentioned or that I had sent. I'm going to try and take you through all three of them today in, as compressed a form as possible. But feel free to stop me in the middle and ask me questions. And thank you, Shrimanjari, for also turning on your video. More of you, if you guys do it, I'm actually then speaking to some faces. It feels very nice. So actually, let me then begin by talking about an aspect of the Green Revolution, not quite what Dr. Tirtha mentioned, I'll get to that, but an aspect of the Green Revolution that is really not discussed much in the literature. And this is a linkage of Green Revolution to nutrition. So we pretty much understood Green Revolution as a food security story that, we had famine, we had hunger, we needed, we were sort of backward in terms of our productivity. And so we got these high yielding varieties of seeds and they created this miracle in the 1960s and 70s. And lo and behold, we are now food secure. So we have enough food to feed all our people. Now, let me, run you through some of these important statistics in the nutrition space. And then I'll link the nutrition story to the Green Revolution story because it doesn't quite, fit quite right. Now, if you look at the NFHS, the National Family Health Survey, which number 5 took place in 2019-20, and we only have data from, I think, 14 states at the moment. It turns out, as an aggregate, I mean, there's a little complexity in doing the aggregation, but broadly as an aggregate, there is this one surprising fact that stands out quite starkly. That is, 1 out of 4 Indians are malnourished. So we still have a significant amount of people in our country who are undernourished, not getting, the adequate amount of food or certainly not the adequate basket of food. But surprisingly, 1 out of 5 is obese, overweight or obese. So what we are facing, and these numbers were lesser. So when NFHS 4 was done in 2012-13, the numbers were a little less. They were more undernourished. 1 out of 3 was undernourished, and one out of 6 was obese. But clearly, obesity and undernourishment are catching up to each other and increasing along in the same population. And this, in the public health nutrition space, is known as the double burden of malnutrition. So it's mal in both ways, right? Under and so called quote unquote overnutrition. Now, what does this have to do with the Green Revolution? It has everything to do with the green revolution, is what I'm going to try and argue. I'll take about 5 minutes to build up the nutrition story, and then we'll get into the rest of the impacts around the green revolution, and then finally I will get to the story that Dr. Tirtha has sort of laid out, in terms of, was the green revolution necessary and inevitable as it is made out to be by policymakers, even by historians, certainly by economists. I'm sure many of you who have heard this broader story in the agricultural economic space is about increasing productivity, technology, and the role of technology in transforming productivity and all of that. So I'm going to try and challenge that towards the end. And those of you who are interested in the details can look at the EPW paper. That is the one which specifically challenges the green revolution narrative. So let me come back to the nutrition story. How is it that we have all of these people who are undernourished still? And let me give you examples of undernourishment. We have one of the largest populations of stunted children in the world, and stunting is when you are short, for your so your height is not equivalent to your weight. So at a certain weight you should have a certain height. I mean, I'm sure many of you, well, I guess I don't know whether you guys will ever remember your own childhood, but I'm a mother, so I just went through this some years ago. But when you have kids, you'll take them to the pediatrician, and then the pediatrician charts them, right? There is a height and a weight, and then you see, oh, is the child growing well enough? Are they in the middle percentile? Are they on the top, on the bottom? And so these are all medical ways of trying to determine whether a child is healthy or not. And a large number of people in our country, kids in particular, and then when they grow to adulthood, they don't actually reach the height they are supposed to reach, for their height for age, sorry, not just weight, height for age. And one of the biggest reasons for stunting, according to nutritionists and Dr. Veena Shatrughna, who's the head of the National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad, she's written about this, that protein malnutrition is critical in this space. So when your tummies are full of cereals, for example, you may be satiated, you may gain weight, but you will not gain height, because height requires, to build bone and muscle, you require protein. Thank you, Anika, for turning on your video. You require protein for building bone and muscle, and that is missing from the diets. The other thing that we have, which NFHS 5 shows, is anemia. The anemia numbers are mind boggling, because in the last 25 years, we have seen a rise in anemia in the country. So supposedly in the last 25, 30 years, we have, improved our diet. Supposedly we have had a lot more diet diversity. We've, done good things. Our incomes have gone up. And, it's because incomes have gone up, there's something known as a calorie puzzle and all of that. I won't get into all of that. But the broader logic is that we are supposedly doing better on the diet front, at least according to a lot of economic data sets, large scale data sets, the NSSO, and other kinds of the ones which are tracking food consumption. But anemia is going up. I mean, we have more than 50% of women and children who are anemic. It's bizarre. And anemia is measuring hemoglobin levels, or broadly iron levels in the blood. And it's of course very, very important in terms of your metabolism and all of the other kinds of parameters to keep your body healthy. So this doesn't seem to make any sense. Like, how does one explain this? The third thing that we are seeing in our country, which is again linked to this double burden of malnutrition, is an explosion of, I guess maybe you guys can tell me, there has been an explosion in our country that I would bet everybody in this class today would know at least one person suffering from this problem. If anybody can raise their hand and tell me. And it's come up in the last 25 years. This new problem. Anybody? Okay, lifestyle problem.
Diabetes, blood pressure.
That's absolutely right, Dr. Tirtha. It's diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So there are two different types of diabetes, one which is sort of genetically linked and one which is lifestyle oriented. And we have seen an explosion of diabetes. I'm sure everybody, like I said, I would be surprised if I find one person in the room who doesn't know somebody, either in their family or friend circle, who is not diabetic. At least one person would be. And the rates of diabetes have again astronomically risen, such that India today has amongst the largest populations of diabetic people in the world. So these three things in the nutrition space are turning out to be quite complicated challenges for public health, because as you know, diabetes makes you prone to a variety of other kinds of diseases for every part of your body, from starting with your eyes and your feet and your legs. Just any and every organ gets affected by diabetes. So let me then take us back to the Green Revolution. What does this actually have to do with the Green Revolution? What the Green Revolution did, and here, I mean, if you guys are interested in the data, I'm going to try and skip over the detailed numbers and just tell you the trends. But if you're interested in the data, please write to me and I'll share the material with you over email. What the Green Revolution has done in the last 40 years is actually transformed our diet significantly in two important, well, in multiple ways, but two broad trends that you can see. One is that it has shifted us to a very low fiber diet. We have moved to highly polished everything. So we have moved to highly polished rice, highly polished wheat, highly polished sugarcane products, so which is white sugar. And all of this stuff is what was propagated and subsidized for farmers under the Green Revolution. So if we go back and understand the Green Revolution package, what was produced, or what farmers were given, so the seed varieties that were available were for rice and wheat to begin with. The subsidies that were given in terms of input subsidies were given again to farmers who were growing rice and wheat. And I'll get into the package in a little bit once I finish the nutrition story. And so what we did is, I mean, what farmers found is that this was a winning proposition for them. It made economic sense for them to grow rice and wheat instead of growing other things. So they grew a lot more rice, wheat, and sugarcane, because these were also the three crops that the government was buying from farmers. It wasn't buying anything else. And so as farmers started growing more of this rice, wheat, and sugarcane, it was basically became much more available, much more cheaply available to the masses. It was provided to people not only through the public distribution system, but also through the regular market system. And what it created was, along with that, a base for industrial products. So what you see again, especially from the 1980s and 1990s onwards, is state-led subsidized development of rice mills, sugar mills, and flour, maida production. So all of this is done broadly under the logic of food security, that we're going to be providing cheap cereals to the masses. And here, as you can see, food is equal to cereals. And again, you go back to that logic, we were hungry, we were dying, there was famine. And so, at least something is better in the stomach rather than nothing. And so let's provide them this. But a lot of this was also linked to a story of modernization, that your roti is old fashioned. What is really quote unquote nutritious, and this comes from the records of the World Bank, for example, saying that in the 1960s and 70s, I don't know if any of you remember, there was this new brand of bread that came in called modern bread. And this modern bread was supposed to be the bread that, according to the World Bank, was going to solve the nutrition problem in India. How was it going to solve the nutrition problem in India? Because it would have, it would be fortified with some kind of vitamins or something else in it. Now, you can see the bizarre logic here, that maida is basically the gluten part of wheat. And it is that part of wheat which is the unhealthiest part of that grain. When you process the wheat in your stone chakki, either at home or in the village, or even in your small town in the vicinity, there would be a regular chakki wala grinding your wheat. you would get whole grain atta effectively. 92% of the atta is what you would get, 8% would go as what is known as choker or the bran. The minute you started processing wheat in factories, in these roller flour mills especially, what you got was 52% maida, and much of the other good stuff, the bran and the fiber, much of that went into cattle feed or into animal feed, or into making other kinds of products, not into the food supply chain. The atta, in fact, that we are getting is a lot more refined than the stone ground chakki atta that we used to eat in the past. So the same story is also the story with rice. What we are getting, the industrially polished and processed white rice that we are getting, is it's been polished so much that there is hardly any fiber, or again the vitamins and minerals, the nutritive part of the grain is on the outside part and nothing much in the inside. So what we are eating basically in terms of polished white rice is starch. And similarly with white sugar, right? I mean, this is chemically treated and so-called again purified. So the larger point I'm trying to make here is this: the shift in terms of the food security story is certainly a story in terms of, oh, we have to deal with hunger and feed all these people. But the other part of that story is also a story of modernization, where modern bread or highly polished rice, these are the foods which are refined. There's another story about oil, which I can get into later. But the notion of refined oil, that these are the elite foods that everybody should be aspiring to, should be striving to have. And those were the ones that were popularized under the Green Revolution, and that created a greater availability of these not very healthy raw materials to make our food with. And not only are we so then, for example, right, the samosas that we are eating are made out of maida, or the cakes, and of course everything else, your Maggi, your biscuits, your noodles, all of it is actually using the raw material of maida rather than the whole wheat atta that used to be used in the past. So this maida has become an important industrial product that has permeated our processed food system, and the rest of the basic grains that we are eating are only now rice and wheat. And those are also highly polished and not very good for our health. So that's actually the first part of the story, of the nutrition story. The second part of the nutrition story is that what did we lose in the process? This is what the Green Revolution gave us. It gave us foods that were not very good for us. And it gave it to us both in the name of filling up bellies, but also in the name of eating like better, modern, wonderful, refined kinds of foods. But the second bit of the story is what we lost. What we lost in the process was the entire food diversity on our farms and on our plates. How did we lose that? Well, basically because farmers were incentivized for growing rice, wheat, and sugarcane predominantly across the country, especially in irrigated landscapes, and then eventually also in dry land landscapes, people started growing wheat in, Madhya Pradesh, for example, Western MP, where there's hardly any water to grow it. They stopped growing pulses, millets, and oilseeds, which formed the bedrock of our food and nutrition security in the past. And so in the past, when fields were multi-cropped, you had multiple things grown on the same land. You would have an oilseed crop, a pulse crop, and a cereal crop mixed on the same land at the same time. In Kharif, there would be different combinations. In Rabi, in the winter, there would be different combinations. And these changed with agroecology, with region. If you look at the production graphs of different states of the country, and the one for Punjab is the most interesting, and I guess I should have put it in the pulled it out to show it to you guys. But basically, you see the line for 1950 shows you 10, 15 different things, 10 different bands of different crops that are being grown. And then you come to 2000 and it's two bands. It's only rice and wheat. So all of the other stuff that farmers in Punjab actually grew has disappeared from the farms. Now, what has this done to consumers? How is this linked to our impact in terms of nutrition? It's linked because if farmers are not growing it, we are not getting it and we are not eating it. And so what we have seen in the last 40 years is that we have been importing, because we're not growing enough of it, we've been importing oil seeds and pulses from everywhere else in the world. We are the world's largest consumer of both of these items, and we don't grow enough of them. Even though, ironically, you go back about 60 years ago, and India was exporting both oilseeds and pulses. So the irony of the Green Revolution in terms of the food security story is that we were supposedly food insecure in the 1960s, even though we were exporting pulses and oilseeds. And, till about the 1930s, we had been exporting wheat to many parts of the world, because again, wheat was more of an export crop rather than a home consumption crop for us. But we were deemed to be food insecure. We pushed our farmers to grow rice and wheat. We became supposedly food insecure, but now we're importing oilseeds and pulses to the tune of more than 75 to 80%. It's completely bizarre how we can even use the narrative of food security to describe our situation. It makes absolutely no sense, because if you imagine a thali, we took one part of that thali and we expanded it hugely, and then we took the other part of the thali and completely shrunk it, because the unavailability, even though we've been importing pulses and oil seeds, if you and you guys are economists, I'm sure some of you can actually look at this data and analyze it. The prices of pulses and oil seeds have been quite high and out and unaffordable for a large majority of our population. Even though supposedly, we are importing it because it's cheaper, but there are other kinds of distributional logics, other kinds of monopolies or oligopolies in these systems, in both these cases, that have not that have basically ended up making these oil seeds and pulses unaffordable to people. So what you are then seeing, and then of course what has disappeared from our diets, is millets. If you guys speak to your grandparents, I'm sure from whichever part of the country you are from, you will be given the name of one or two important millets that people ate in the past. And this is across caste and class. This is not, so again, millets were considered to be a food for animals, food for underprivileged caste groups, but even upper caste groups usually ate a mixture or some part of millet in their diets. In central UP, for example, where I have done some of my work on nutrition, wheat was never eaten by upper caste households by itself. It was always eaten in a mixture called gojai. So that had jaw, which is barley, it had wheat, and it had a little bit of gram or chana. And the proportions would vary by caste. So underprivileged caste groups would have more of jaw and less of wheat, more of barley, less of wheat, and upper caste groups had more wheat, less barley. But the logic of mixing these grains was again to improve the broader nutritive value of that cereal, because wheat again by itself is not necessarily very nutritious amongst all the millets, but you mix it up with these other grains, and that improves the broader nutritive value of that mixture of grain. So this basically is the nutritional consequence or the impact on nutrition of the Green Revolution, transforming our diets in such a lopsided manner that we are now facing these huge consequences in terms of nutritional impacts on, on our bodies and on our children's bodies. So I'll quickly, briefly pause here in case there are any questions on this, because then I will now move to the next bit of the discussion today. If there are any clients. Yes, Gayatri.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I just had a doubt regarding your statements. So you said we were the largest consumers of pulses and oilseeds through import. At the same time, you also said that we are not intaking so much of that pulses and oilseeds and such. We are lacking nutrition. So I found a contradiction in that. So could you explain to me?
Yeah, good question. So the largest in terms of the importing nations of the world. So given our population, we are importing a huge quantity. You compare it to the, one, pulses are not really consumed in, most other parts of the world. India is one of the very, very few countries where pulses are actually consumed, because they're a very important source of protein for the fairly large vegetarian population. And so given that, we are importing a great deal. And similarly, in terms of oil seeds, we are importing in terms of quantity. But if you look at per capita consumption and you look at how much different social groups are consuming, then it's very, very little in terms of the actual amount that should be consumed by people. So
Thank
we are
you.
comparing apples and oranges here. In the case of trade, we are comparing other countries, how much they are importing, and in the case of our own consumption, we are comparing per capita how much individual people are or households are consuming.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Please feel free to unmute and ask. Yes, Mohammed.
Ma'am, you told me about that. Hello, everybody.
Mohammed, if you can repeat, please.
Okay. Can you say about the narrative behind this invoking the rules in the 1960s and the police for
Shamal, you're not audible. Maybe you can type in the chat box.
Yeah, Shemal, perhaps type or maybe use a microphone or something that might help.
It was, yeah.
Right. Anybody else? Maybe Shamil can type in the chat box. Anyone else with questions? Okay, while you guys are maybe thinking of the question, I'll add one more little bit. For me, the nutrition story is the most powerful story of the Green Revolution because, we've often heard of the ecological consequences, we've heard of the socio-economic consequences in terms of, regional inequality, in terms of, climate change, natural resource degradation, groundwater, all of those stories we are fairly familiar with. But I think the worst is that, we pushed a policy in the name of food security, but it has only destroyed our own nutrition security and our food security in various kinds of ways. So that's sort of that narrative for me is a really powerful story that we really need to understand through evidence and data. So, two more stories I wanted to add in this. One is the shift from good to sugar. Good is jaggery. So again, if you speak to your grandparents' generation, everything was made using jaggery or some other kind of sweetener. There are multiple kinds of sweeteners that actually existed in the past. And now everything is based on white sugar. So what has happened is not only, we've had partly the diabetes epidemic is in some senses linked to this very high consumption of sugar. But our anemia story, the lack of iron story, is linked to the stopping of consumption of a whole variety of foods that were so rich in iron in the past, including jaggery. So jaggery, uncultivated greens is something. Today, the ones that we know are palak and methi, spinach and methi, I suppose is methi in English. I'm not sure what it may be called.
Fenugreek.
Fenugreek. All right. Thank you. And in some parts of North India, people still remember bathua, which is a weed grown in wheat fields, and you may eat that. Some people they get soya ka saag, but it's a handful. 5, 6, 7 greens. Some people eat leaves of the radish, mooli ke patte. But if you go back and document it, a lot of this stuff has been documented by various kinds of groups across the country, not just in tribal areas. That's the other interesting part. This is in heartlands of settled cultivation. You see the quantity and the variety of uncultivated greens that had so much nutrition packed in them that people would not even grow. They would just collect them across different seasons and consume them. And then the kinds of varieties of recipes that existed, all of this has the greens have gone away. Can anybody guess why the greens have gone away? Anybody? Anybody who's been on a farm, in the last few decades would sort of figure out what has happened to all the weeds. What do we do with the weeds now? So these greens are basically weeds on the farm. Afaz, maybe you can take a pick. If you're speaking, Afaz, we cannot hear you. Is he typing something in the chat box? I'm not seeing the chat box. Okay, no, very limited markets is what he has said. Okay. No, it's not that. The answer is fairly simple. The answer is we decides. So weedicides have come into our country in the last 25 to 30 years, and they have ensured that anything that was not the main monoculture crop on the field is killed and destroyed. And so all of these greens were uncultivated because they just randomly grew on the fields along with other crops, and then they were collected predominantly by women and then, cooked as part of different meals. But weedicides have now, of course, everything else is a weed, and it has all been killed by the new weedicides because that's supposed to be the modern way of farming.
Kamran
So,
has typed his question in the chat box.
okay.
Can you pull out the narrative?
PL480. Yes, absolutely, Shaman. That's the second part of my story, but I've realized I'm already half an hour through and I haven't even reached the main part of the story of the Green Revolution. I'm still talking about the nutrition story. But okay, sure. So that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about next, Shaman. So, let's get let's get straight into that then. Let's now transition to the fact that the Green Revolution has had fairly disastrous impacts on our country. So not just ecological, not just social, economic, political, but also nutritional and in terms of food security. So and sort of the broader critique of the Green Revolution is like, okay, we needed it at a certain point of time, which is like 50-60 years ago, because we were hungry and starving. But now, of course, we have enough food, and so let's sort of get off the Green Revolution bandwagon. Let's do farming that's more sustainable. Let's do farming that actually works in terms of the ecology. Let's do farming that sort of provides for our nutritional needs and all of that. What I'm going to do today is try to make sort of two arguments in relation to this. One argument is already in the article that is with you, the EPW article, which challenges this view in terms of history. And it says that actually we certainly don't need the Green Revolution model now because of all these problems that are described, but we didn't even need the Green Revolution model then in the 1960s. And I'll run you through one by one in terms of why I am making that argument. And this argument, of course, is not very palatable to a lot of folks. But like I said, if you guys are interested in some of the data, then I'm happy to share some of that with you guys. And it would, in fact, be good if more of you are interested in looking at some of this historical economic data and actually trying to tell us the real picture of the 1950s and 60s in terms of our agricultural situation. The second argument I'm gonna try and make is that today, even if we want to shift away from the Green Revolution model to something else, we are stuck in a particular kind of logic of industrial agriculture that is in some senses intertwined with the way we eat, the way we function as consumers, and it's intertwined with the kinds of options and possibilities that farmers have. And so moving away from the Green Revolution actually means moving out of this industrial logic. And that's going to be very challenging. And I'll outline a little bit about what the industrial logic in agriculture is all about. So let me come back now to the 1960s and talk about that story. So the predominant narrative of the 1960s is that India was the stuttering democracy, too many people, overpopulation, backward, ignorant farmers, and we didn't have enough food to feed ourselves. The biggest symptom, or let us say the biggest piece of evidence for this, as Shamil has already put in the chat, was the existence of imports of food. And the largest imports of food that we had in the 50s and 60s was through the PL 480, which is the Public Law 480, which basically was food that was exported by the United States and provided to many countries of the world, especially in Africa and Asia, including India. And this was essentially treated as evidence to say that, oh, India has been moving around with a begging bowl in the international market for food, which basically means that India is food insecure. It doesn't have enough food to feed all its people. And in some senses, because it's again, if you go back to that point of time in terms of we had just become independent, decolonization was still taking place in different parts of the world, so there was also this very racialized logic in terms of the modernization theory, that this is a traditional backward country, people don't have the technology or the skills to do very good quality farming, so they are not able to grow anything much. And again, this whole the modernization theory again about this is a country that is backward, so they have too many people, too much fertility, too many children, and all of that sort of needs to change. Now, this narrative of backwardness in farming as well as backwardness in terms of population and fertility have been challenged several times fairly successfully with a lot of evidence by many historians. So again, let me clarify, I'm not a historian, but several historians have, and in fact, the biggest and not just the narrative about backwardness in terms of production or backwardness in terms of population. The biggest contribution and the Nobel Prize winning work in agricultural or economics is at the heart of this story, and that's the work of Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen is the one who would actually intervene in this debate around food security and famines to tell us a different story. So what is the story actually in terms of the historical reality? How do we set the historical record straight in some ways, or how do we at least challenge the historical record that has been created by this very dominant discourse, global dominant discourse, that India is this kind of basket case? For this, we have to actually go back to the colonial period, and that's where we have to begin our story. So if you go back to about the 1870s, so about 150 years ago, you see the broader subcontinent is afflicted by a series of famines. Famines where there are, yes, production failures in many parts of the country between 1870 and 1902. So in about a 32 year period, we have many famines, some dozens of famines. And in total, in that 32-year period, we basically lose, according to official British statistics, we lose 13 million people. That's 1-3. And according to unofficial statistics that population economists have put together, population historians, but who are looking at economic data, have put together, demographers also, they have said 30 million people. That's 30. That is 1/10 of the population of the subcontinent at that point of time. So what you see happening then is demographic catastrophe. And this catastrophe has been re-looked at using data, again, building on Amartya Sen's work, which was on the Bengal famine of 1942-43. The dominant narrative of the Bengal famine, the dominant narrative of these colonial famines was that people died because of the story I just told you. Too little food, too many people. And so obviously people will die. The whole Malthusian logic. Amartya Sen's work showed us that actually no. If you read his very famous essay, Poverty and Famines, which I will urge you to read because it's a fantastic exercise in, looking at data and making an argument using data. He shows very clearly how, in fact, there was no production loss at all. The year of the famine, Bengal actually produced more food grain than the year before. Even though there were, other import restrictions and other kinds of stories that were going on because this was during World War II, overall, there was no food production deficit. The problem was that during World War II, inflation had become so high. The price of food and everything around started rising so high that, rice, which maybe say 10 rupees or 30 rupees a kilo, is suddenly now 3,000 rupees a kilo. I mean, I'm giving you a sort of comparative number in today's terms. So at 3,000 rupees a kilo, imagine how many people in our own country today are going to be able to afford a kilo of rice. And this is what happened. What you suddenly saw was an erosion of entitlements, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, the entitlement theory, right? And when you have an erosion of entitlements, it's no longer about this erosion of entitlements is not because of a lack of supply. I mean, that in the sense, it is not because of lack of production. It is because supplies either are not being distributed in the appropriate manner, or they are being requisitioned for elsewhere. So the Bengal famine of 1943 is a classic story of colonial audacity in killing people in different kinds of ways. So some of the food grain was in other parts of India, which was available, was sent off to Africa to feed the soldiers there. A lot of the food grain that was available in Bengal was hoarded for the cantonment areas and the urban areas of Kolkata and Dhaka, where the British had their own people that they wanted to be fed. And so what you see again and again in the stories of Bengal, and they're beautiful plays and essays and poems on this if some of you are interested. People are dying in front of warehouses of grain. I mean, that is the sad part. They're dying in front of food. It's not, there are these poor people trekking into the cities, and they're dying when they can see other people eating in front of them. And that's exactly the story from 1870 to 1902. People then also are dying in front of railway rakes and wagons and godowns full of grain. And the prices of grain have shot up so badly. The British have also transformed our agricultural system such that farmers are being forced to grow cash crops. They are disallowed from growing food crops. If any of you have gone back and studied history, there is that whole indigo revolt in Champaran that took place, which was again about forcing farmers to grow indigo rather than growing the kind of food crops that they needed. Across the country, this happens. So farmers are not allowed to grow food crops. This is a more complicated story in terms of agrarian history, but basically the British cut our feet in terms of agricultural production. We are not allowed to use our own water harvesting systems. They get into disuse. All kinds of policies are made which essentially create a situation of very low agricultural productivity in terms of food. The cash crop story is very different, but the food crop story is that between 1900 and 1947, the growth rate of food crops is zero. There is absolutely no growth in terms of food production in the country, overall food production. And so when we become independent, we inherit a system that is already in tatters. And then we are told on top of that, oh, you guys are backward and you guys are ignorant and you guys don't understand technology and you guys don't, have all of this, this so-called stuff that the rest of the world, or at least some parts of the rest of the world has. And that we need to teach you guys how to farm. We need to teach you how to, do all of these other things. We need to bring this technology to you. And that's how you will improve. So that's one bit of the story. But what you see happening after independence, the story of the 1950s and 60s is very, very important in here, which is that once the British leave, agriculture actually changes quite phenomenally in the 1950s. It's like as though you have taken a prisoner and freed the prisoner from jail. The biggest thing that happens is there is now no longer taxation on agriculture. So whereas a huge amount of agricultural revenue or agricultural produce was being pushed to the state in terms of tax, that is now coming back into the hands of the farmer. Second, there is a huge amount of investment that happens in water resources. So I'm not just referring to the big dams, which of course, you have the whole Nehruvian story of dams at the temples of modern India. But there is generally farm level investment in harnessing water. And that is because the British actually taxed investment in water resources. So if anybody had a well on their land, they would have to pay several times the tax on irrigated land as opposed to unirrigated land. Now that tax is gone, and so farmers then push into irrigation at their own local levels. And then what you see in the 1950s is a huge surge in productivity and production across all crops. And this data is very interesting because the surge in productivity has never been repeated ever since. That's the only decade when you have this level of an increase in productivity on the land. what you are then seeing on the farm is, in some senses, freedom. There's, of course, land reforms that take place partially in many parts, but they also bring different kinds of changes in terms of the kind of impact in specific parts of the country. And, several other policies around this time. The story in the cities, however, the story of the consumer, however, is very different. Now, what is that story? Because that is the story which is the dominant narrative and which sets the tone for this begging bowl that, India is taking around in the rest of the world. Now, the story at the consumer level is such that, remember, about 85% of our population at that point of time is still in the villages. And they are growing their own food, they're eating their own food. They really are not linked to the state in any significant manner. The 15% of our population that's actually in urban centers, and these are now urban centers that have been established under colonial rule. So these are cantonment centers or port cities, or places where you're getting iron, steel, all of that, the mining stuff. So there are places of specific economic relevance. These are the places where during World War II, British set up what was known as the ration shop system. And now this ration shop system was set up in these places because the British wanted to ensure that they got enough food from the countryside to feed the urban laboring classes and everybody else that was associated with the war machine. But when they left in 1947, they left us with a legacy of this rationing system that had divided the country into a crazy kind of controlled market for food. And so what we had was surplus states that were growing a lot more food than their requirement. And then you had deficit states that were not producing enough food for themselves and would need to get food from the surplus states. And so there was this kind of exchange that was taking place that was coordinated by the ministry in Delhi, which was a very, very complicated affair. Remember, this is also the time when India is trying to integrate princely states. This is linguistic reorganization of states. I mean, this is a chaotic time in terms of central state relationships. And so navigating this food story is really complicated. There's a very interesting paper by P.C. Bansal, this economist, agricultural economist, perhaps some of you are familiar, which he'd written in the late 1950s, early 1960s, where he talks about this kind of back and forth, where he gives a very interesting table. And he says that, when you ask the surplus states, how much grain do you have? They're obviously dumbing down the number. Instead of, saying 100 that they have, they're saying, no, we only have 50. And when you're asking the deficit states, how much grain do you need? And if they need 100, they're saying, oh, we need 200. So he says, as an economist, these numbers will never match. We will never be able to fulfill the needs of the deficit states, and we will never be able to have the grain that we need from the surplus states. So this dance around is going on. But this dance around, why is it going on? This dance around is going on to supply the rationing system, to supply the urban laboring classes, which are, well, we say 15% of the population, but again, not everybody in those cities has access to those ration shops and is getting that grain, essentially. And so when the Americans come to us in the mid 1950s, 1954 is when they come to us. And they come to us because they have this big grandiose plan, which is known as the Marshall Plan in Europe. And it's known as PL 480 everywhere else. They come to us and say, oh, wait, we have a lot of grain that is basically lying around. We don't know what to do with it. I mean, they don't tell us that, right? They have all this grain that's lying around. Their farmers have been overproducing this wheat and the soybean. And, effectively, it's like they could simply dump it in the Atlantic Ocean. They don't know what to do with it. And then you have Europe that is coming out of World War II, that, everything is decimated in Europe. And so the Americans are like, we'll give you everything and we'll give it to you for free. Because it's cheaper for the Americans to push this food onto Africa, Asia, and Europe for free, rather than store it and pay its own farmers and figure out what to do with it on its own soil. And so the Americans tell Europe, this is all free, it's all part of the Marshall Plan, and of course you're giving free food, so you're getting a great deal of you're the big wonderful dada in the picture. And so you get a lot of clout in the process. And we are like, our policymakers are like, we are really struggling with this whole deficit state, surplus state, dealing with these demands, this rationing system, it's all chaos. The Americans are telling us they'll give us this food grain for free. It'll come to the ports. And remember, our railway system at that point of time, at the end of colonial rule, was set up to go from port to hinterland in very specific ways, right? I mean, if you look at Madhya Pradesh, for example, it's a classic story. None of the major cities are actually linked through any kind of straight railway line because they were all part of the princely states. You have these very complicated teda-meda railway lines that don't go technically anywhere, but they go to the places where you get your minerals. They go to the places where you get very specific, where ammunition factories were there. That's where the railway network goes to. But that's where the urban centers were and where these ration shops also were. So for our policymakers, this American wheat, which is basically free. How is it free? Very quickly, I'll tell you. The Americans tell us you pay for it in rupees. You don't need to pay for it in dollars. And then all the rupees that we get from you, we will spend it in India. So it is spent on American consultants in agriculture and in a whole variety of other places. So effectively for us, it's free. So this wheat comes to the ports and it goes straight on the railway rakes and then it's distributed to the ration shop system that we have in the country. And lo and behold, we have now solved multiple problems at one stroke. I mean, in some senses, this is a genius solution of policymakers in the 1950s. You don't have to deal with the states. You can provide the ration shop system which exists. You don't have to deal with all this decontrol, recontrol, whatever crazy, stuff that's been going on in terms of the movement of food grains. And you are able to keep your most important classes happy, which is your urban laboring classes, the urban middle classes, who are also the people who have the most voice in the system in terms of the relationship with the state. And you are able to save foreign exchange. So then you can use it for importing equipment for industrialization. And the best thing of all, you are able to keep your wage bill low because you're providing the subsidized food to people in the working classes, in the mills and the factories, industrial areas of the country. You can actually depress your wages and then you can reorient that capital for other kinds of purposes. So it's really a win-win situation for us in the 1950s at that point of time to take this PL480 wheat. Remember, again, PC Bansal shows us very interestingly how in the years of high production, we are still importing PL480 wheat because this importing has nothing to do with our domestic production or domestic procurement. It is entirely to do with fulfilling the needs of the ration shop system. We haven't sorted out our distribution problems. We don't have the roads. We don't have the trucks. We don't have any broader system of buying grain from our own rural areas and bringing it to our own urban centers. Those logistical systems don't work. We don't have the Food Corporation of India also at this point. So there is no procurement agency centrally that can coordinate all of this stuff. So this American PL480 solution is a fantastic solution for us. Now, what happens after the PL480 story? So, of course, we've thought we've done a fantastic thing. The Americans are happy. Their wheat is sold. We are happy. We are getting all of these benefits out of it. But what are the consequences of this? So one of the main consequences I have already explained to you, that the rest of the world now thinks, oh, these guys don't have food, begging bowl, inko khana chahiye, we need to supply food to these guys. So famine, hunger, starving Indians, overpopulation, that narrative gets a lot of support because of the existence of these imports. The second thing which happens is what happens, I'm sure all of you guys here would know this, what happens when you import a particular food item in the country. I'm actually going to now ask somebody to reply to this, and not Dr. Tirtha and not Dr. Tyagu. Maybe Hannah or Haldar or somebody. I'm assuming you guys are agricultural economics students. So what happens when you import? You should know the answer. Anybody can unmute or you can type. This is just to see if you guys are still going. Sorry, who is that?
This is Sakuntala.
Sorry?
The price of the product, like food products, will increase when we import.
When you import something, the price will increase.
Yeah. Like it's like food is like basic necessity for everyone. When you will
Correct.
import, then might be that price of that product will be increased, then it will be more create more, it is more problematic, and we cannot achieve that food security level, I think.
So you're partly right, but the economic logic here is, I think, the opposite. Anybody else who would like to add to this? Thank you, Shakuntala. Thank you for being brave enough to reply. Yes, Gayatri.
Ma'am, is it this reason that people become more dependent on a particular crop? If we import that, if, for example, if we are importing wheat, then we become more dependent, or likely the likelihood to that particular crop increases, and we tend to cultivate that more in our country.
Again, partly right. The first bit, what you said, and Rohit has also said that to us, that we become
Is
dependent
it
on that.
affect like exchange rate?
Okay, Ansi is talking about the exchange rates. Well, so remember the PL480 is more complicated because it's coming for free. Haldar has told us that price will decrease. He's absolutely right. That is what happens actually, that remember, you're getting this for free. There's no price as such other than, the logistical costs of getting it and supplying it into the system. So what this does, both what Rohit and Gayatri are saying is also right, that we become totally dependent. So our ration shop system becomes totally dependent on this imported wheat, because we don't build the infrastructure to buy it locally or to procure it locally for our urban centers. But what also happens is that at the farm gate, the price of wheat stays stagnant. It doesn't really rise the way the price of other crops are rising. And also, along with what I think Gayatri mentioned this, people start shifting to wheat. So urban laborers now start shifting their diets from millets to wheat. And so the demand for millets also goes down. And so millet prices are also now not rising in the same way, or not keeping up in the same way. So farmers then stop growing that much wheat. If you look at the production charts of the 1950s, you will see rice production is increasing, millet production is also increasing, but in comparison, wheat production is stagnant. We go from about 7-8 million tons to about 10-12 million tons. That's it. And in terms of rice, we go from, I think, 30 million tons to 40 million tons. In terms of millets and gram, we go from 20 million tons to 30 million tons. So, that's like 1/3, 1/4 increase. In terms of wheat, it is about 8 to 10, but really not significant in that sense. And so what we are seeing is we are actually hurting ourselves on both fronts. On the consumer front, we have created a system that is dependent on this importing channel. On the farmer front, we have created disincentives for farmers to grow the kinds of crops that we supposedly need, at least particularly wheat. Now, why is this important? This is important because the entire discourse of the 1950s and 60s around food security centered around rice and wheat. Millets were nowhere in the picture. Now, why is that important to us? If you take the data for 1965 and you look at our total food grain production, we had 80 million tons. Out of 80 million tons, like I said, half of it, 40 was rice. 30 million tons was millets and gram. And only 10 million tons was wheat. If you actually look at international statistical analysis on India, those millets are not even in the picture. They are not even counted as food. What is counted is sometimes not even the rice. So I have read, several stories and arguments. I'm sure you guys may have also read, but the most common one is 10 million tons of wheat, 500 million people. How are you ever going to feed them? And that's constantly bandied about. This whole Malthusian logic is projected in this way. 10 million, 500 million, won't make any sense. Obviously, right? That's not going to make any sense. What about the other 70 million tons that we produced and we ate? And then what about everything else? The pulses, the oilseeds, the fish, the meat, the milk, the dairy, the uncultivated greens, the fruit, the vegetables that people collected and grew on their own, thatched roofs and all of that. Nothing is counted. Food only becomes rice and wheat. And in that logic, we buy into the story that India was food insecure, India was starving, and that is why it needed the push of the Green Revolution. Now, of course, you guys will say that 1965, 1966, we actually had these famines. And because we had these famines, we had to scramble. And then, if the Green Revolution seeds would not have come, we would have all died, or at least a lot of us would have died. Now, that again, if you look at this very interesting work by foreign policy historians and some other historians of the Cold War, they have dug up documents to show that yes, there were localized droughts in many parts of the country. But again, if you look at the production data, even in a place like Bihar, where a lot of the PL 480 food was sent in 1965 and 1966 because of drought like conditions, what failed was the jute crop and the cash crop. The food crop was fine. So again, the problem was not a problem of lack of production. The problem was localized droughts, but there was enough food in the country if we had the wherewithal and the logistical capacity and the ability to control the lobby of the trading classes, which we hadn't got at till that particular point of time. We would have been able to tide through the system. But because by 1965, we are completely dependent on PL 480 for our rationing system, ration shop system. We haven't invested in the rest of the stuff. We are scrambling. 1964, 1st January, we start the Food Corporation of India. Then we set up all of these policies to, control hoarding of traders. We have set up, various legislations come up, the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees, Marketing Acts, the APMC Acts come about during this period, the 60s and the 70s, where we are creating a marketing infrastructure in every district where farmers can come and sell and we can procure and all of that. None of that is existing in the 1950s and early 60s. And so we are at a point of time in 65 when we are totally dependent on the Americans for a chunk of our urban population. And we are now facing droughts. We don't have a logistical system to procure from our own farmers. But over and above that, we are in a political and economic disaster. Now, do you guys remember what happened in 1965? That was a political and economic disaster for us. Anybody? I know I'm randomly throwing out these questions in the hope that you guys are not sleeping and are still engaged with what I'm trying to say. But anybody, 1965, somebody should remember what happened.
War with Pakistan.
Sorry, Shamil?
War with China.
Okay, two of you said the war with China was 1962, and that was also very important. 1965 was the war with Pakistan. Both of them were important because they messed us up in multiple ways. The war with China messed us up, of course, in terms of our finances. So all of this money that we had set aside in the second and third plan for industrialization and other stuff now had to be put in for defense because we are not paying much attention to our defense. And because of that, we squeezed our policies in a way that agriculture got very little attention by this point of time. So if we needed money to procure from farmers, that money was hard to come by. The free PL 480 was much more practical for us to deal with at that point of time. 1965, the war with Pakistan, what happens because of that? Any guesses? Maybe Niranjana or Rajalakshmi or Rohit, Rekha, Hitesh, anyone, Himanshu. What happens? What do you think would happen because of the war with Pakistan? This is now a geopolitical question. So I'm asking you to link PL 480, geopolitics, war with Pakistan, and then there's a big consequence of that.
Ma'am, some issues related to basmati rice, import export of basmati rice through Punjab.
Well, so remember, basmati rice is an elite commodity. Here we're talking about PL 480 wheat.
Oh.
So then answer in the chat box.
Okay. US, yes, Shamal is absolutely right. The US now refuses to provide us with grains. So it's not just the war with Pakistan, what we also do to annoy the United States, and more than annoy, they were really upset with us. I mean, upset is also an understatement. Johnson was really, really mad at us. We criticized the American action in Vietnam. So remember, this is the height of the Cold War, and as you can see at this very moment in time, right, we are also playing the political game between the two powers that be in the current war that is going on. But at that point of time, we chose to criticize the Americans, or at least not support them in the war with Vietnam. And so they are hopping mad at us. And then the war with Pakistan, and so they're like, Johnson basically tells us, I'm going to withhold those PL 480 ships. You will only get it at a monthly or a bi-monthly notice. So remember, these ships have to come all the way from the US, right? And there is about a 6-month period between when you order, when they actually come, when they reach the port, you offload that stuff. So a 2-month, month-to-month window is a very, very short window to plan all of this procurement. And so that gives rise to what is very, very famous, this phrase that I'm sure everybody here would have heard of. Anybody remember that phrase, perhaps? Or maybe Dr. Tyagu or Dr. Tirtha, maybe our generation, I don't know, or our parents' generation, they definitely remember that. It was called ship-to-mouth existence. So this is what was ship to mouth, that the ship will come and then the grain will come and it will reach the ration shops, and then somehow we will get to eat it. And the grain also which came at that time, a lot of older bureaucrats, especially people who were in urban areas at that point of time, middle class or upper middle class households now, their grandparents' generation will remember the lal gehu, or the red wheat that came. Really not very tasty. It was the red winter wheat of the United States, and it would cook red, sort of not quite, we are used to our sharbatis and our wonderful kinds of wheat varieties that existed in our country. So the lal gehu had to be eaten, and it had to also be eaten under circumstances where, the Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri in 66 is telling us, give up a meal, fast one day, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, we don't have food. And so please eat the lal gehu. And help us, we are in a dire situation. So people remember all of that logic. And remember that kind of deprivation, and more than deprivation, they remember the humiliation of the United States. So that PL 480 is totally associated with this humiliating experience that we had. And so that then sows the seeds of a very big policy shift in agriculture. So you can see now that this policy shift is not coming out of any kind of evidence or data that we have a production problem happening. This policy shift is coming from the fact that the United States is arm twisting us and we want to break free. And the way we do that, so again, now remember the droughts of 65 and 66. Does the Green Revolution bounty help us in 65 and 66? No, because in 65, the Green Revolution high-yielding variety seeds of wheat are basically sitting in C. Subramaniam's garden in Lutyens, Delhi. They are in few plots in the Indian agricultural research system. The seeds have just come, and you have to multiply them, right? You get 1,000 tons of seeds. They're not going to go to many farms. You have to ultimately multiply it and then supply those seeds to a lot of farmers. So in 65, Subramaniam this is the agricultural minister at that time, C. Subramaniam, who was the architect of this policy shift. He then tells these people to plow up his garden in Lutyens, Delhi, because he wants to see what this miracle wheat is all about. And so the wheat is there in a few experimental plots in the agricultural research system. In 66, again, it is being multiplied mostly around the Delhi and, some predominant districts that were chosen under a Ford Foundation program. And it's only by about 71, 72 that this wheat actually shows up in sufficient quantity to then replace the PL 480 in the ration shop system. So it is actually the PL 480 imports itself. So we basically placate the United States by giving them access to our fertilizer markets, by devaluing our currency, by doing other kinds of handshake things that we do with them in 65 and 66, and tell them, please keep sending us that wheat. So they do. In 1966, we import the largest amount of PL 480 wheat. about 8 to 9% of our total wheat production at that point of time. Remember this also. It's the largest amount, but it's less than 10% of the total wheat production in our country. And so you can imagine what a significantly small percentage it is of total food grain production in the country. And so uh, that wheat is then sent to us, and then it's only by 72 that we eventually we stop in 72, but then we again start importing again PL 480 in 73, 74, 75 for other reasons. There again, the Americans want us to take it, and we're like, okay, we'll take it. I mean, so again, production issues are in some senses irrelevant to the story. The import of PL 480 wheat is a totally different kind of consumption story, not actually linked to our agricultural production system, except that it is used as the fulcrum of the argument to say that India was food insecure, so India was importing, and that is why India needed to change its agricultural system. And that is why you needed to adopt this package. And of course, so that's also, it's incorrect to say that the Green Revolution saved us from starvation in the 1960s. It didn't. PL 480 saved some parts from somewhat kind of starvation. I mean, that's again a complicated story, like I've said. The Green Revolution stuff only comes in late 60s, early 70s. And that package that comes through, and this is when I want to, use just a few minutes and then I'll stop for questions because I know I've been talking nonstop. The package is a very important package. It is not just a technological package. It is an entire institutional package. Now, what is this package? Of course, you have high-yielding variety of seeds, but those seeds only work if you put enough fertilizer in them and you put enough water. If you don't put fertilizer and water, the seed will not yield anything. Like a desi variety of wheat will still yield something, but these will not. These high-yielding varieties will not. And so you need to provide farmers not just with seeds, but also with water and fertilizer, which of course requires money. And so, and no farmer is going to be willing to take the risk on something new and put in money. Remember, at that point of time, cash again was a limited resource. So the government then creates this thing of input subsidies. So farmers are then given input subsidies to get fertilizer, to get water, electricity subsidies in particular, to then put in tube wells, to pump in water, canal water for pumps for canals and all of that. And then the most important institutional aspect of the Green Revolution package is the output guarantees. So you have the technologies, but then with the technical stuff, you have input subsidies and then you have output guarantees. Those output guarantees are critical in getting farmers to actually shift to growing high-yielding varieties of wheat, rice, and eventually sugarcane. What is the output guarantee? It is a blanket guarantee that whatever amount you produce as a farmer, the state will buy it from you. And will buy it from you at the magic word, the minimum support price, at an MSP, which will be calculated in a way to ensure that all your costs of production are met and you will get something in return. And so this package is what then drives the shift that I have already described, with farmers en masse throughout the 1970s and the 1980s in the heartland of the Green Revolution states, which is Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, parts of Andhra, a few parts of Bengal. They shift to growing these high-yielding variety of wheat in parts of Tamil Nadu, where procurement then takes place by the Food Corporation of India. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, you see this shift happening in the dry land regions of the country. States like Madhya Pradesh start procuring wheat, and so farmers then shift en masse to these high-yielding varieties of wheat in parts of Madhya Pradesh. Chhattisgarh starts purchasing rice. So then farmers then now are shifting to very specific varieties of rice. And that transforms the agricultural landscape. And as I described earlier, it transforms the nutritional landscape of our country. And I can see, I'm already an hour and 20 minutes through, and I haven't yet spoken about the industrial logic of agriculture, but I would suggest that, the piece which talks about valuing variability, that talks a little bit about the industrial logic. Broadly, what I want to argue is what the Green Revolution has done, and in linkage with the industrial logic, it has removed the diversity from our food system. And it has produced these standardized foods that we are eating. And I just want to share one picture with you. I actually took this just a few days ago. So this is pictures from my own house. I'm making this sound very dramatic, but it's not so dramatic. But I will share the picture and then I will tell you what I'm trying to say. And let me see if I can do this correctly. Okay, are you all able to see this? So this is 2 thalis of tomatoes from my own house. As you can see, the one on the right is tomatoes that grew in my backyard. These are desi tomatoes. And you can see the multiplicity of colors, and you can, I don't know if you can see the holes in them where the insects have eaten them and all of that. Some of them are green, multiple levels of variability in terms of also ripeness. And then the ones on the left are what I had ordered from an online website for household consumption. And this is hybrid tomatoes. As you can see, broadly similar size, although there's still a little variation, and fairly uniform color. So I'm showing this, as an emblematic example of what we have done to the food in our country and to the farms in our country. And this is just example of one crop. We have done this for a whole variety of crops, thousands of varieties of rice. Now we all remember basmati. Hundreds of varieties of wheat, and now we barely remember a few that we are eating. So many varieties of banana, but now you only get that one banana, at least up in the north. And that's true for every single crop. But more than that, all of the other diversity, the hundreds of types of greens and fruits, like for example, now we think if you want to make your food khatta or sour, we only think of tomatoes and lemons. But in the past, people used tamarind, they used kokum, they used narangi, so many other things which are now really absent, or they are no longer available also in urban areas, even if we want to use them. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And if I can figure out how to stop.
At the top of your screen.
Yes, I found it. Sometimes these systems become a little confusing. So, and I guess we have, I think, just about 10 minutes. And so I'm happy to take more questions, discuss. I'm hoping more people may turn on their videos perhaps. And yes, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richa. Thank you so much. It was a very interesting talk. Probably the best way we could have ended our day today. It was, we learned, all of us, I'm sure, we learned so much, students. So please, all of you, now I'm going to be a bit strict. You haven't switched on your video. At least ask questions to her. I think you all, please read the chat box. There's something in the chat.
Yes, yes. So there are questions now. So one is Krishi Pradhan Desh. Does this particular line still exist? That's a very interesting idea, actually, and reminder. Krishi Pradhan, I'm sure as economists, you guys would be perhaps familiar with this data, right? That I think about less than 15, maybe 13% of our GDP is now coming from agriculture. And of course, there are issues about how that's calculated. Do you take in allied activities and all of that? But it's not really a big deal in terms of actually contribution to in terms of income and GDP. But of course, as we all know, less than 50%, between 40 and 50% of our population is still deriving a livelihood from agriculture. And so, do we use that to say we are a Krishi Pradhan Desh? I mean, I think the answer would vary. Certainly, a country like the United States, where less than 2% or 1% of its population is in agriculture, can't be called a Krishi Pradhan Desh. But I also want to take you back 400 years ago and actually ask, what does it mean to be called a Krishi Pradhan Desh at all? I mean, because the idea is that agriculture is the most important activity, and we are an agrarian society, and that's sort of this broader logic that we have sort of been told. If you go back 400 years ago and you look at the occupations and things that people did in India 400, 600 years ago, pre-colonial, I'm talking about, before the British came in really in a substantive way, you find people doing a whole variety of things in the rural space. You also have an urban space, you have a rural space. They are intertwined in interesting ways, but people are weaving. Remember, India was the largest exporter of textiles globally. We were growing the cotton, we were making the yarn, we were weaving the cloth, we were dyeing it, doing various kinds of different artistry around it and exporting it to markets globally, whether it was Africa, Europe, Australia, Southeast Asia, all of that trade existed. And that meant, I mean, we had, Banjara communities, for example, today, which are known as gypsies or itinerant communities. They were at the heart of the trading network in the country. They were the ones that brought salt from coastal regions to everywhere else. They were the ones that took products from, mountainous areas to other parts of the country. You had a huge set of social groups that were involved in metal, mineral, and working with materials to essentially make all kinds of products, everyday products, but also arms and ammunition. So Bastar, which is known as sort of the boondocks today, god-forsaken place, was the heartland of the arms and armament trade in the country, because that's where you had specialized caste groups that were making the finest swords in the country. So the diversity of occupations that existed, people would be a farmer in one, households would do farming in one season, weaving in another season. So it wasn't very much this notion of, rural is agriculture or the country is agriculture. The diversity of occupations was very important. What colonial rule did was it sedentarized people. So pastoralist communities, trading communities, Adivasi communities, various kinds of social groups who were not settled on the land, and even farming communities who would move from place to place in search of fertile land. I mean, again, you were not tied to land because land was not private property in the same way. All of that mobility became restricted and people were then pushed onto the land. So in some senses, what we have seen in the last 200, 250 years is an agrarianization of the country. This notion that we are an agrarian country and nothing else is in fact a fairly recent notion. And so we need to break ourselves from these imaginary shackles that we have put ourselves in and reimagine the rural and the urban as a far more complicated multi-occupational space. And then, think of how we want to imagine our country and our future. Okay, there are a lot more questions on the chat. Let me look at them. And I hope this answers your question, Rohit. Okay, there's a question on Western fertilizer companies. I'll just respond to it very, very briefly. So what we did was we did joint venture sort of. I mean, that's a modern way to call it. So we had investment from Western companies, but ultimately most of our initial fertilizer companies were state-owned companies. This requires a more, I mean, maybe Shamil, we can take this offline and I can, suggest some readings for you on this. I'm now looking at the next question, Afaz's question. So I'm not sure I understand the first sentence of your question, but very quickly to respond to the question of vegetarianism. So that's absolutely, what you're pointing out to is absolutely correct in the sense that there has been a significant movement vegetarianization is also part of the larger logic of Sanskritization. A lot has been written on this in sociology and in the sociology of food. If anybody is interested, or Afaz, I can send you some readings later on. The classical example of this is for instance in the midday meal system. Midday meal in Madhya Pradesh, midday meal in Karnataka, and many of these states, they are not providing eggs to students. And so we are not even talking about meat, but something supposedly innocuous as eggs, which is a very important source of protein. Remember, I spoke about stunting in the beginning, and eggs are an excellent source of protein for children. The irony here is that the midday meal is for government schools. The predominant category of children in the government schools is Dalit and Adivasi, who historically have had non-vegetarian diets. They've not had much in terms of access to quantity, but certainly they've had non-vegetarian diets. And in the name of variety of things, those children are being denied access to eggs by saying that it's not part of their cultural ethos or something. So again, there's some very interesting statistics on vegetarianism where I think some studies, large scale studies are showing that we're about 40%, 30 to 40% vegetarian, not more than that. So we are not a majority vegetarian country, we are a majority non-vegetarian country. And that is true, again, interestingly, if you look at upper caste or privileged caste groups in Tamil Nadu, parts of Tamil Nadu, or Bengal, Northeast, Maharashtra, and of course, you have the Thakurs and the upper caste in UP and Bihar and elsewhere. So non-vegetarianism is not only a underprivileged caste group or Dalit caste group or, a Muslim or Christian religion phenomenon alone. Several middle and upper caste groups across the country consume non-vegetarian food because it is more linked to geography and ecology in a sense, rather than so much to, of course, there's a linkage to religion and caste, but there is an economic and geographical logic to the consumption of non-vegetarian food. And if you guys are interested, I can share more work on that. There are a few more questions. Okay. Okay, Haldar or Imdadul, if you could write to me specifically, I can suggest some references, sure, and I can share my email address. There is a question on organic farming and future mode of agriculture. I'm not sure whether I can use the word mode of agriculture, Shamil. And Himanshu has asked about organic farming. Certainly, we need to reorient our agricultural system to work with nature, to work with ecology, because, and this is an aspect I wasn't able to speak about much today, which I wanted to. This is that whole industrial farming logic. And it's 7:30. Can I take a couple of more minutes to respond?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. What we have done in the industrial logic and under the Green Revolution is shift to monocultures, which is growing one single variety on the entire field. And now you have acres and acres across several districts and across several states where that same variety is grown, across thousands and thousands and lakhs of hectares. What that does is it creates what is known as a technological treadmill and a technological trap, where you are creating, or nature doesn't work like that. Nature works on diversity, because if you grow one single thing in nature, and some insect attacks it or a disease attacks it, then you can imagine lakhs of hectares will be spoiled, which is what actually happens today. If anybody here is from Punjab, then they may remember in 2015 the whitefly infestation destroyed the crop, and which is why you need pesticides to control these insects. You need fungicides, then you need weedicides, because you want to make sure that all of the nutrition is going to that one single crop of yours. But over time, you generate what is known as pest resistance. Which is also like antibiotic resistance, if you guys are familiar. So you're giving that same medicine to the pest, and then 90% of them will die. 10% of them will become immune to that medicine, and then they will become into these super pests. And then you need a more potent pesticide to deal with them. So over time, farmers are then having to buy more and more expensive and more potent pesticides to deal with this problem. And monoculture farming has also destroyed the soil fertility, because you are extracting the same set of nutrients from the soil and not replenishing it in a holistic manner. So we're only putting predominantly nitrogen back into the soil, not the other things, and then certainly not the micronutrients, and certainly not the organic carbon which is required. So just a couple of days back, there's this huge set of news items that came across several newspapers talking about the condition of India's soils, which says that, you know, we are deficient in all the major macronutrients, including organic carbon, across 90% of our soils. So it's a disaster situation. And so, if we have to shift, we need to start working with nature, which basically means bringing back the diversity into a cropping pattern. You can't grow one thing alone. You have to grow multiple things in the farm. Go back to your pulses, millets, oilseeds combinations. And then also, but then to do that, you have to rework your agricultural knowledge systems so that farmers can figure out how to do that. To do that, you have to change your markets. Now we are all used to that wonderful hybrid tomato that is coming to us, which is full of pesticides and chemicals. And you look at that desi tomato, it's green, it's hard, it's got a hole in it. You don't want to eat that. So it's also about changing consumers and our expectations about what is good quality, what is bad quality. It's about changing supply chains and markets. So it's a complicated story. Organic farming, again, is one set of possible solutions, but there are many more. We need to really broadly rethink agriculture as if it sits in nature, in ecology, and not just in economy. You know, we have so far made all our policies as though agriculture is about economy. But agriculture is a lot more about ecology rather than about economy. So the minute we embed it back in ecology and then think about the economic logics around it, those are the kinds of solutions we need to think about. And I think I have covered all the questions.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think you've covered all
Professor, may I ask a question?
Yes, Rohit.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very engaging talk. On the point about monocropping, you have covered that, it's the same varieties being grown, especially in like, green revolution parts of North India. But what I was curious is how much has been the impact of like green revolution on like displacing like traditional crops that were like mostly grown as like substitutes of like like barley or millets or tapioca in Kerala. So in places that are far from, say, like the Green Revolution concentration states, say like Kerala or like Northeast, which also probably had different food cultures that were not really wheat or like the Green Revolution focus rates. What has been the impact in terms of changing the nutritional, like like the core heavy? Has it also been intensively shifted to rice and wheat? We do know that, but what's the do we have studies precisely isolating the effect of Green
So
Revolution on
what
that?
you're saying is a very important question. What we need, we don't have regional studies in terms of specific states or agroecologies documenting agrarian shifts in a holistic manner. We have production data, but we don't have these broader regional stories that link food and diet and agrarian change in interesting kinds of ways. The Kerala story is, of course, a plantation story, right? So Kerala has anyway been a food deficit state for a very long time, and it's been importing the rice that it also eats. And that logic has been somewhat different, but the plantation logic is the monoculture logic. So that problem of not working with nature and not working with ecology applies to Kerala also, and the kinds of issues that arise in a plantation economy are very similar to the issues which arise in a broadly monoculture rice wheat kind of economy. The Northeast story is again more complicated, and there aren't very many good studies on that, so I can't really comment on necessarily how things have changed in terms of staple crops there. I know in the broader Deccan heartlands of the country, which are the millet growing and millet consuming regions, northern Karnataka, parts of Telangana, parts of rural Maharashtra, Marathwada, millets are still grown and consumed in some little quantity because these places don't have enough water to grow rice and wheat. But the minute any of these places is able to afford digging tube wells into groundwater, they shift to rice and wheat. And so that is the story of Malwa, Western MP, where there's very little water, but they're all drilling the tube wells to over 1,000 feet, and they're all growing, very highly water intensive wheat. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richa. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And I'm sure, and thank you, participants, for asking questions, engaging with her. Yes, so uh, we are grateful to you that you accepted our invitation and delivered such a wonderful lecture. So, and we are sorry for keeping you so late. It's almost 8, and yeah, that is all. And I thank all the participants also for staying with us so late. Tomorrow again we start at 9:30. The first session we will have is with Professor Khera. That will be a hybrid session. So we will have it. So students who are here, please come to the Joan Robinson Hall, and the rest will join us online. Right. So thank you once again. Thank you, Richa, once again. Thank you, all of you. I'll end the session then now. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. It was my pleasure to come. Thank you. And thank you for engaging, turning on your videos. It was great. Thank you.